I hope you're well. Welcome back to my channel, and welcome to today's video, which is my somewhat belated December wrap-up. You're probably watching this in mid to late January, and that's partly because there was just so much that I wanted to do as far as like end of year wrap-ups and like 2022 goals and the like, that this is kind of kept getting pushed back further and further. But we're finally here. Let's talk about the 7 books that I read in the last month of 2021. Why don't we dive right in? So the first 2 books that I want to talk about are 2 of my 2021 anticipated releases that I managed to read in the 11th hour. I just squeaked them in before the buzzer, or whatever that expression is. And the first of those books is The Women of Troy by Pat Barker, which I've talked about countless times on this channel at this point. I read The Silence of the Girls in 2020, and that book shook me. I knew nothing about it, even though it had won awards. I hadn't really heard anyone talk about it. And then I read it, and it was like a hallelujah moment if you're religious. If not, it was just eye-opening. I absolutely loved it. So when I found out that it was part of a duology and that the second book was coming out in 2021, I was more than a little bit jazzed about it. So as I said, this is part of a duology, and it is like a feminist retelling of the Iliad. This one focuses on what happens after the Trojan War. So basically, the Greeks are waiting for the winds to change so that they can all disperse to their home cities or city-states or whatever you call it in ancient Greece. And basically they're just sitting and waiting. But it is largely, like The Silence of the Girls, about the women who have been captured and are now prisoners of the Greeks and adjusting to this way of life. In a lot of cases, the women, like the character Briseis, were royalty, and now they are the sex slaves, the concubines of the Greeks who won the war. And I will say that I really, really enjoyed it. It had a lot of the beautiful writing that I've come to know and appreciate with Pat Barker, but it wasn't a 5-star read for me, unfortunately. It was a very solid 4 though, so I still very much enjoyed it. And like The Silence of the Girls, this book is told from multiple POVs, so you have Briseis again, who is kind of like this bridge between the Trojan women who are prisoners and the Greek soldiers who are the conquerors, the winners in this war, because she interacts with the other Trojan women, and she also interacts with the men on a pretty regular basis, because she's in this weird position where at the end of The Silence of the Girls, Achilles has died. Sorry if that's a spoiler. But he's died, but she's carrying his child, and he has married her off to one of his loyal supporters. I believe his name is Alchemist. I might be pronouncing that completely wrong. But so she's in this weird position where she's not quite Greek, but because she's married to a Greek and carrying a Greek child, she's not exactly in line with the Trojans. But you see her interacting with some incredible characters like Hecuba, who is one tough broad, let me tell you, and then also Cassandra, among others. And then there is also the POV of Achilles' grown son, whose name I believe is Prius, and so his POV is also there, and he's a bit of an ass. He's young, and he obviously has a lot to prove because he's Achilles' son. So those are 2 of the POVs. And then there is this third POV, which to me is, I think, part of what brought the book down. I believe his name is what? Calchas? Calchas is his name. And he is like a priest of some sort, and his POV is there in the book, but I didn't understand why it was there, why he had to be pulled out in that way when other supporting characters weren't. I think it slowed down the pace of the story overall, and to be quite honest, it is a slow, character-driven sort of story, and because the war has already happened, there's not a whole lot of like big events taking place. This is a lot about what's happening in the camps, what the women who have to like come to accept their new realities, how they struggle or grapple with that. It also has to do with the Greeks suddenly thinking, well, maybe we can't go home because we've angered the gods, and like them somewhat turning against each other in their quests to find out how they angered the gods or who angered the gods. But it is a slower paced book, and I think Calchas's POV just kind of slowed it down a little bit more. That being said, though, I really, really enjoyed the book still. I am still a huge fan of Pat Barker. I did give it 4 stars, and I think if you're someone who liked Circe or liked The Silence of the Girls or any of those sort of feminist retellings of ancient Greek, like, you'll probably enjoy this. I had a lot of fun with it, and Pat Barker is definitely an author I want to see more of at this point. I actually just finished another one of her books set in World War I, so you'll hear more about that in January. But this was pretty successful overall. The other of my anticipated releases from 2021 that I managed to read in December was A Swim in a Pond in the Rain by George Saunders, which I already spoke about because it was one of my favorite books of 2021. And to be honest, this was unlike any other book that I read this year. It kind of is in a class all of its own. It is nonfiction, but it is essentially a master class on writing short stories. So George Saunders teaches this MFA writing course at, I think it's Syracuse University, where he teaches the art of short story writing by looking at short stories written by Russian literary giants like Tolstoy, like Turgenev, Chekhov, Gogol, all those sorts of people. In this book, he's kind of truncated what is usually a semester-long course into 7 sections where you're looking at 7 short stories, and then he is teaching you about why they are successful and how you can use what he's just kind of revealed to you to hone your own craft as a writer. So for a writer, I think this is a phenomenal book, and I think that even if you aren't a writer, this is a book that will teach you how to read more analytically, because me being someone who is not a huge fan of the short story, read this and had such a appreciation for the craft itself. I've always been someone who is much more drawn to long form fiction and nonfiction just because I feel like the story arc, the longer arc, works better for me. But this kind of made me very curious about how maybe there are certain short stories out there that would work for me, and also just taught me to kind of appreciate the nuances in crafting a short form piece. So it was really, really eye-opening, and each of the different short stories approaches writing a short story in a different way, and you learn about like patterns in stories, or you learn how to kind of workshop a story by reading it 1 page at a time, just as a couple of examples of what this book is like. But it was so, so good. And I do think that some people might be intimidated by it because it's Russian authors. I mean, I love the Russians, as anyone knows by this point, but I could see people being perhaps a little intimidated by that or turned off by it even. But I just want to say that George Saunders makes like the approach to reading them so accessible. His sections where he's teaching you are so conversational that it almost feels like you're sitting in like a seminar with him and he's just kind of talking off the cuff to you. And I think that is just absolutely masterful. So I had a phenomenal time with this. I would say, though, that this is not a book that anyone should rush through, especially if it's something that you really want to learn from. I would also say that this is a book that engages certain like reading muscles that you might not be accustomed to if you've been out of school for a while, but it makes sense. It requires a bit more of an active reading experience because it is a master class. It is a class, so you wouldn't passively be sitting in a class. You would be actively engaged in it. And so that is part of it. And honestly, I do think that it's a book that you can't rush through. I feel like the best way to read it is probably to read the short story and then the section that follows and kind of let yourself sit with it for a little bit and then move on to the next section. But this was an easy 5-star. This is a book that I will certainly be referring to in the future, whether it's because I decide to write something or whether it's because I just kind of want to remind myself how to read more analytically or more critically in the future. But easy 5-star for me. Now let's talk about one of my 5-star predictions for 2021. Katherine by Anya Seton. This is a book that I have wanted to get to for ages and just haven't, and I finally did. And it was certainly worth the wait. It wasn't quite a 5-star rating. I did end up giving it 4 stars, but it was a lot of fun. Like, the reason I picked this up was because I heard a lot about Anya Seton from other historical fiction authors. I've heard her referred to kind of as like inspiration or someone who set a high standard for what I believe Anya Seton called like the biographical novel, where she focuses on a particular individual and their life. That was something I remember seeing when I first bought this book a couple of years ago. And that's really what this is. This is a novel about Katherine Swynford, who lived in the 14th century in England and had this romance with John of Gaunt, who was one of the English king's sons. And it's so fascinating because you do feel like it's so well researched. It's in the time of Chaucer. In fact, Katherine Swynford is Chaucer's like sister-in-law, and you have like the Black Plague, and you have the wars with England and sort of continental Europe, and just all the sort of chivalric, like courtly stuff with jousting and knights wearing someone's favor and just all that sort of thing. And I don't read a ton set in that time period, so it was really nice to kind of be transported there. And it's really interesting hearing about Katherine and John of Gaunt because basically the English royal lineage comes from them. They are like the ancestors to people in both the Tudor and in the Stuart line. The Beauforts, that's from them. So it was really interesting learning about these two figures that I really didn't know anything about. So Katherine and John are very much kind of this like star-crossed romance in that like timing never seems right for them. One of them is married or both of them are married, and eventually they do enter into this relationship, and she is his mistress for a very long time and has children with him, and it's really a love story that spans several decades, but it was really interesting. The reason it was not 5 stars for me, though, is because I do think that this is very obviously not something that was written recently. This was written in the 50s, and so there is something about the writing style that I do feel like is a little dated, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. It's just something to bear in mind. And because of that, it does very much feel like a relic of the time period. I would also say there were some things that happened in it that felt very melodramatic, and that might also just be the nature of when it was written. But because of those things, I couldn't entirely give it 5 stars as much as I did enjoy it. But despite all of that, I am very, very interested in reading more by Anya Seton, and so I'm sure that you will see more of her books on my future wrap-ups. So we do have that to say for it. The next book is another one that I was very, very excited about, and that is The Last Station by Jay Parini. Again, a book that I've spoken about time and time again on this channel. I absolutely love this movie. It's probably among one of my favorites. I weep every time I watch it. I love Helen Mirren's performance. I love Christopher Plummer's performance. I love that James McAvoy is there for eye candy. It's just a beautiful story for someone like me who loves Russian and who has a very special place in her heart assigned to Leo Tolstoy. But this is a novel about the final year of his life. And it's kind of a tumultuous year because he and his wife are having some conflicts, partly brought on by the interference of the Tolstoyans, so basically his disciples. And the book is really interesting in that it's told from multiple POVs, whether it's from Sophia, one of his daughters, Bulgakov, who is like his assistant, Chertov, who's one of his devoted disciples, his doctor, but you never really have Leo Tolstoy's POV. You have like these excerpts from like letters he wrote to other people like Gandhi, and you maybe have a diary entry, but you never have like really a fully fledged POV from him. And so the entire book is really looking at both Sophia Tolstoy and Leo Tolstoy and their relationship through the eyes of other people. And it's really multi-layered in that way. I personally love Sophia Tolstoy. She is an individual that I am truly fascinated by because of her involvement in Leo Tolstoy's work. But in this book, the problem is that she's been married to Tolstoy for decades, I think close to 50 years at this point, and she's always been involved, and the Tolstoyans don't want her to be. And they, when it's in their POVs, paint her as being very manipulative and melodramatic and just not pleasant. And she paints them in a very similar light. She does not like them, and it's because she realizes that the Tolstoyans are trying to get Leo Tolstoy to change his will, which would write out herself and her children from like getting royalties or being responsible for his works after he passes away. So it's a very tense situation, and the Tolstoyans kind of infantilize Tolstoy, make him seem like he can't really make his own decisions. They also demonize Sophia Tolstoy. It's just fascinating for me to read about Sophia and Leo Tolstoy's life because you do get her talking about their earlier years. You also see her struggling to kind of be involved in Leo Tolstoy's life in the same way that she had been decades earlier before the Chertovs of the world became involved. Whew, that was a lot. Anyway, I think if you are someone who is interested in Russian history, interested in Leo Tolstoy, that it's certainly a book that is worth reading. Unfortunately, it didn't live up entirely to my expectations. I ended up giving it 3.75 stars on the story graph, and that's just because I do think that, oddly, I was more moved by the movie than I was by the book. As I said, that movie makes me cry every time I see it, and I've seen it well over a half dozen times at this point, like probably a dozen or more times. And so I would expect a book that is dealing with the same issues to also have some sort of connection for me in that way, and I didn't cry. Yes, I did know what was coming, but every time I watch that movie, I know it's coming. But I wanted to have more of an emotional connection that I did, and this was another book, again, where there was some melodrama And so I would be really interested in seeing if that is based on fact or if that was really just Jay Perini's writing style. But because I wasn't 100% sure, it kind of did make Sophia Tolstoy, who also has a special place in my heart, feel a little silly at times. So that bothered me a little bit. But overall, I did enjoy it. It just didn't quite make it to a 4-star read for me. But the fact that I didn't give it a 4-star was something that I definitely had to come to terms with. The next book is one that I have been trying to get to literally all frickin' year, and I finally got to it and then annotated the crap out of it. It's Mrs. Dalloway by Virginia Woolf. This is a modern classic that I had a feeling I would really enjoy, and I did. I had such an interesting time reading this book. There is a reason that Virginia Woolf is Virginia Woolf. Like, just wow. Just so good. So the entire novel is written in stream of consciousness, and it actually isn't broken up into chapters in the traditional sense. It is just one long thing. But it focuses on Clarissa Dalloway, who is throwing a party later that evening, and her preparations for that day. And in the midst of those preparations, her former lover, the man that she ended up passing over to marry her husband, kind of waltzes back in. And so you hear a lot about the two of them and what they thought of each other then and what they think of each other now. And you also have this other character, Septimus, who is unfortunately a soldier from World War I who is suffering with PTSD. And because the book is stream of consciousness, you kind of fluidly move through the minds of these different individuals over the course of the day. You're very conscious of like what time it is the entire novel, which I thought was really interesting. And it's just beautifully written. This is definitely a book that I want to reread and take a little bit longer with and probably annotate even further, because there were just so many interesting aspects of this book that I feel like I could further explore. Like, this is an English major's dream, this book. There's so much to unpack from it, and I thought it was marvelous. It's definitely a slower paced story. It is definitely more character driven. It is a book that is taking place over the course of a single day, and there's not a lot necessarily happening. The book is really more about what's in these people's heads, and so sometimes you go off on a tangent and it's just beautiful. But one of the things that I found so fascinating about this book is how much World War I figures into it. I didn't really know that from having seen other people talk about it. I didn't realize that it was really in part a World War I novel. It's set after the war, but the impact of the war on London at the time is very, very prevalent. It is also a book that I feel like is like an homage to London in itself, like a love letter to the city, and it was just stunning. I gave it 4 stars, but as I'm talking to you, I feel like this is a book that I should probably up to 5 stars, because it does meet that I'm going to want to reread it in the future sort of standard that I set for 5-star books. But the writing in this is chef's kiss. I definitely want to read other books by Virginia Woolf. As I said, I want to reread this book as well, and I really enjoyed it. But I will say that this is not going to be a book for everyone. I know that stream of consciousness isn't something that everyone goes for, so I would just caution you about that. I'd also caution you if you're someone who isn't into like character-driven stories or wants more of like a plot. I feel like the plot here is very subtle, but it's really about the characters and their internal lives more than anything. So I loved it. I would say it's worth a read. if you're interested. And now for the last two books, which I'm going to talk about together because they are the final two books that have been published so far in the Outlander series. We are talking Written in My Own Heart's Blood and the newly released Go Tell the Bees That I Am Gone. I'm going to hold them this way so that you can see them, but I managed to get through all 9 Outlander books in 2021. I didn't think I was going to be able to do it, but I did, and no regrets. It was exhausting. I read, I forget how many pages, I think it's nearly 10,000 pages. I'll put the number on the screen for you in case anyone is interested, but I did it, and I can't wait for the last book in the series to come out so I can complete it. This was also something that I talked about in my 2021 Best Books of the Year because I couldn't spend all that time reading the series and not put it on the list because it is probably my favorite series of all time. So we have Written in My Own Heart's Blood and Go Tell the Bees That I Am Gone, Book 8 and Book 9. And yes, it drives me crazy that it's the mass market in the hardcover, but I would have had to have waited like a year for this to be released as a paperback, and I couldn't do that. So both of these were good, but like many of the books in the Outlander series, they are not perfect. I can't honestly go into much detail about what happens in the books because that would be spoilers for anyone who hasn't read up to this point in the book, but I will have reading vlogs for these coming up sometime soon in the next few months. I basically have, I think, books 6 through 9 to finish editing, but they were good. They were enjoyable. If you like the Outlander universe, I think you will have a good time. I think, as I said, they both had room for improvement. So with the 8th book, I ended up giving it 4 stars. I do think that it was interesting. It captured a lot of the essence of Outlander Book 1, I think, because there's a lot going on, but it's also a book that has a lot going on outside of just the plot. You have so many POVs now that are introduced throughout the book. You also have 3 separate timelines that you're following at one point, but there's a lot going on, and there's a lot going on, if that makes any sense at all. I do like book 8 though, because you start to get Brianna and Roger trying to really understand how this time traveling thing works, which is fascinating. They're trying to kind of understand why some people can travel and some people cannot, and I'm hoping that that is somewhat resolved by the end of book 10. Right now they're still just kind of theorizing on it, but it is interesting to see. And it has a lot of like the American Revolution, which I wouldn't expect me to enjoy, but it is fascinating. Now, when it comes to book 9, Go Tell the Bees That I Am Gone, I ended up giving this 3.75 because unlike Written in My Own Heart's Blood, where there's a lot of like plot and action happening, Go Tell the Bees That I Am Gone feels a little bit quiet. And it feels like for the longest time I was waiting for things to happen. And it also felt deja vu-y because it felt like the resettlement of Fraser's Ridge, which happened in the Fiery Cross, which is book 5. So it felt like I'd been there, done that kind of in a way. And for the longest time, I was like, this is probably going to be a 3. This is probably going to be one of my lower ranked books in the series. I think the lowest I've given any of the books is a 3. And I kind of had a sneaking suspicion. But then the last few hundred pages happen, and it kind of rescued the book. A lot of what happened was really high stakes and really enjoyable and definitely had me sweating bullets. So I ended up bumping it up a few points because of that. But as I said, neither of them was perfect. Neither of them were that 5-star or even that 4.5 that I've had with some of the other books. I do think in both of these books there's some weird pacing issues going on where, like, I think in Go Tell the Bees That I'm Gone, there's literally like 200 or so pages about a battle, or it could have been in book 8. In one of these books, there's about 200 pages that is a battle. Ooh. And it ends up being like a fifth of the book, which seems a little excessive for literally a day or two in the lives of these characters, when then all of a sudden the book will cover like months at a time as well. And with like book 8, like the different timelines and time periods that you were in, they didn't always sync up. Some of them were like covering a couple of days, some of them a couple of weeks. So there were some pacing issues for me overall in these books. And I think honestly that's probably one of my biggest complaints about Diana Gabaldon. Sometimes the pacing is a little, it could use some refining. But as I said, I did really enjoy the series overall. Can't wait for book 10. Am really excited about the fact that I got through all 9 books and however many thousand pages that I did. For anyone who is interested though, I would just like to point out that there is an Outlander read-along that's happening on BookTube. I believe it was Christine from over at the Roomies Digest that mentioned it either on her Instagram or in her January TBR. I think they are reading the first book in the Outlander series either in January or February. But for anyone who is interested, I would definitely recommend that you check that out. So yeah, those are the books that I read in the final month of 2021. And overall, I really enjoyed them. There were honestly really no duds, and I hope that that trend continues. So far in January it seems to be, and I will knock on wood because it's still early enough in January that things could go off a cliff. But I did have a wonderful time with these books. I will talk about 2021 books one more time, I think, on this channel outside of the reading vlogs for Outlander. I will be doing my Q4 bookish bracket where I try to pick my favorite book of the quarter, and that will also be the video where I try to pick my favorite book of the year. So stay tuned for that. Hopefully that'll come out more towards the end of January. But I hope you enjoyed this video, and if you did, be sure to give it a thumbs up, comment, and subscribe. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you next time. Bye!